My name is Jeff Philbrandt, and we're going to be going through the major enhancements to 203. So what exactly does this mean? And, first things first, obviously, the software. Where can I get it? What's available? Where is it available? Etc. One of the other things that you'll find with the 203 release is that there is a great amount of documentation that we historically have not had with our releases. So we've got a full set of release notes. There's some other documentation regarding our component set as a whole, our component library, enhancements to components, and all that good stuff. We've got a whole host of new and modified components. So some components you've never worked with before, and some pretty significant enhancements to those that you have maybe worked with in the past. We also have a number of new concepts regarding components. So things like item scale and item margin, wrap, stretch factor, and we'll be going into all of those items in detail. And then lastly, we have this new concept of extended resources. And extended resources will allow you to, import images, icons, etc. that may be valuable to your customer's deployment. So with that, first and foremost, how do I get the software? Well, if you're attending today's meeting, you likely already have an account, an active account and user account on either portal.utelogy.com or demo.utelogy.com. If for some reason you do not currently have an account on either one of those portals, certainly let us know. We can make sure that you're set up with access to that, and you'll have the ability to simply log into the portal and download what you're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead at this time, and we are going to log directly into the demo environment. I'm just going to navigate over to demo.utelogy.com. I'm going to put in my credentials. And right when we log in here, over in the left-hand navigation pane, I'm going to select Resources, and then I'm going to go to Downloads. And right under Resources and Downloads, you'll notice that there's actually a number of items here. I mentioned this earlier. So we obviously have the release itself. So the Utelogy U Enterprise 2.0.3.6866. This is the GA build, or the general availability build. This is available for immediate download. So there's nothing preventing you at any time from simply logging into Demo or Portal and hitting the download link and grabbing a copy of the software for yourself. So with that, we also discussed a large amount of documentation that accompanies this release. So you'll notice that in the same section of the portal, there's a number of other items here. Now we did keep the old 202 build up on the portal. There's really no need for you to utilize that. We kept it there as a reference, maybe for some of our customers who had previously deployed the 202 build that maybe needed access to it again. But for all intents and purposes here, obviously the focus is going to be on 203. So with 203, we have an accompanying set of release notes. The release notes are going to tell you everything that's been included in this build. So we're going to talk about all the bug fixes. We're going to be discussing what's new to this release, new features and functionality, some of those component changes that we're going to be talking about later, as well as other items that are new to the platform, such as U-Access and U-Schedule. Today's meeting will not be addressing the U-Access and U-Schedule components directly. We do have a separate meeting and a separate webinar that we'll be setting up to discuss those components because they really require a separate session. But so you've got all that available to you there in the release notes. And then some of the other items that are available here, these are new. You'll notice that we have 3 items in particular. We have our U-Schedule reference, or sorry, our U-Schedule reference is there as well, but we've got our UVF component reference guide. We have our UVF theming guide, and we have our UVF component development kit. The one that's probably going to be the most applicable to you is the UVF component reference guide. Historically, if you were new to the platform and didn't particularly understand how the components worked, or if you had been through our training session and maybe forgot what a particular component did, there were some small notes within the uConsole application itself that kind of gave you a brief overview of those various components, but it didn't go to a very granular level. It wasn't overly descriptive in what the components did and how they worked. And this UVF component reference guide really does a great job of that. So we talk about each and every individual component that's in our component library for building your user interface or your UI. We even talk about basic concepts like if you're adding a flow container into your project, you've got it set to center vertical or start center horizontal. What are the implications of that? How are the items going to lay out or render on the page? All of that is discussed in great detail in the UVF component reference document. So again, that's brand new. I'd highly encourage you to take a look at it and to talk about all these new component concepts and new components that we'll be discussing here today. A couple of other documents that we have available to us here are the UVF theming guide and the UVF component development kit. So if you have people on staff that are familiar with HTML5, CSS, and maybe some C#, if you guys really wanted to go a little bit deeper in building out a user interface for your customers and you had that background knowledge, you could utilize this section, the theming guide and the UVF component development kit, to effectively either modify existing components that we have in our library or to create new components altogether. So some really helpful documentation. Maybe if that's something that you don't want to explore, it may even be worth a quick read just to give you a better understanding of kind of our component architecture and the framework there. But this is all available to you to download at any time you see fit. So we've obviously discussed the documentation here. And a big focus of today's presentation is going to be on new and modified components. There's really three key areas of the product where we made the most enhancements or changes to components. And those are going to be in our routing components, our panel components, and our widgets. If you are a customer that's coming from, or a partner that's coming from 1.8 and you utilized 1.8 pretty heavily, the panel concept would be probably pretty familiar to you. In our 1.8 platform, we did not have this concept of components. It was all panel based. So you went in, you chose a panel, you basically told it, what your displays were, what your sources were, maybe what your volume controls were, and it automatically built a user interface for you. And what we found is that even though you could recreate that same experience using components in 2.0, some of our customers really like those pre-built panels and that pre-built experience that we had in 1.8. So we brought into the 2.03 release some of the more commonly used panels. And those two in particular were probably the bank panel and the Juniper panel. We also have some significant enhancements to our VTC panel. If you've got a VTC hard codec like a Cisco SX series codec or a Polycom Real Presence Group Series codec, we've made some really pretty significant enhancements there to the VTC Advanced panel. We also now have one really big new component called our button component, simply. This component has actually resided within our component library for a couple releases now, but it needed a little massaging and some enhancements, and I think you'll find with what we've done, it's a lot more usable, and I think we're going to have a lot greater adoption with this component with the enhancements that we've now made. So what I'd like to do for you here now is show you some of these changes. And I'm going to launch my UCons here. Okay, and we're connected. So I'm going to navigate to this UI reference model. One of the other things that we're going to be doing is actually virtually all of the models that are available that you can see within my uConsole here. So I've got this boardroom example, command center example, conference room example. We're going to be making these example model files available as a download for you in Portal as well. So just the same place that we have all of the software itself, the documentation, we should, in the very short term here, have a folder, a zip folder that would contain some of these different model files. The UI reference file or model file is actually a really good model file that you can use to kind of better understand our components. So even after maybe reading the component reference guide, if you still want some more real world scenarios to help you better understand what the components do, you could utilize this. And we designed it so that basically for every section or every different type of component category, we've got those broken out here. And then we've got the various components within those different categories contained within this. As I mentioned to you, one of the things that's going to be the biggest change in 2.0 or 2.03 specifically, coming from earlier versions of 2.0, if you were to ever try and utilize any of our routing components, they were actually under the feature category. So if you'd gone to add a new component, you go into your component library, you go to feature, and we had components such as our feature router. Feature router was commonly used if you had multiple sources to route to a single destination, very commonly used component. We also had our feature destination. So that was a scenario where maybe you had multiple sources going to multiple destinations. In the UI, you wanted to choose your destination first, and then you get a little pop out with the available sources. So those components are still available, but we've now renamed those components and we put them into a new category called routing. Some of the naming conventions that were used previously were a little confusing, maybe weren't that self-explanatory. So we've taken the liberty to rename and reorganize these. So that feature router component, for instance, you were familiar with previously, we would actually now call that a source selector. So, again, with the concept that you've got, multiple sources going to a single destination, well, that really is, you're just selecting a source to go to that one destination. This also has the ability to show controls for any respective devices. So if you have a Blu-ray player as one of your sources, there's a feature property within the source selector where you can simply check or uncheck, and actually I can show you that here. You could simply check or uncheck the show controls button, and with that one button click, it'll opt to either show those controls or not. And there's just a lot more flexibility throughout the entire set of components as a whole. We're not going to be going through every single router component in today's demonstration. Again, towards the end of this, if you'd like to maybe go through one or two of these, we can certainly do that. But I think just based on naming convention alone, you'll see that a lot of this makes dramatically more sense than it had previously. So router buttons and routing, very important, and I think going to be much more usable with this. One of the other items that we mentioned was panels. So if I look under my panel section now, you notice there's actually a few panels here. The ones that we use most primarily are going to be the bank panel, the Juniper panel, and the VTC panel. Again, if you're coming from a 1.8 or if you ever had exposure to 1.8, these are going to make a lot of sense. So again, bank panel would typically imply that you have a number of different sources going to a single display. The Juniper panel would imply that you have multiple sources going to multiple destinations. And the VTC panel is one that you would use if you had a hard codec Cisco SX80 or maybe a Polycom Real Presence Group Series endpoint, something of that nature. And what I can do for you here is I'll pull this up and we'll navigate directly to the UI reference model file that I created. And I'm going to go ahead and power this up. And I'm going to actually go navigate directly into these pages. So I'll go to my page setter page, and we're going to go to the bank panel. So here's an example of the bank panel. In this particular instance, you can see that I've got 3 different volume controls that I've grouped into here. We've got our display controls to turn the display on and off, to blank, do like effectively an AV mute on the display, and then select our different sources. One of the things that I talked about earlier was that show controls. So you can see in this particular instance, I've got a virtual Blu-ray player. I've selected that player, and now the controls for that device become present. But the panels are really a great way if you've got a basic kind of huddle room space or a simple conference room, classroom environment. You don't need anything overly dramatic. You just want some simple controls on the page, pre-built and pre-arranged. A panel can be deployed in almost a number of minutes. So provided that you've got the rest of the work done there within your environment. Juniper panel would again look very similar. I'll just go back to my list here. Just gonna go home actually. I'll go back to the Juniper panel. And in the Juniper panel, you can see the look and feel is actually a bit similar. But the difference here is that if I select one of the sources from the list, you can see that it pops up with a list of the available destinations. So again, multiple displays or multiple sources to multiple destination locations. And then we also have a section for the display controls down here. So in this particular instance, we've got 4 displays, and this would give you the display controls kind of similar to what you saw over in the bank panel here, just with the ability to select whatever your destination display device is that you're looking to control. And then lastly, we have the VTC panel, that up here as well. So the VTC panel, again, like any panel, this experience could be created using individual components, but this is just a method to give you guys a really quick and easy way to deploy this type of user interface. So in the VTC panel, by default, we've obviously got a dialer, so you have your dial and a directory dialer. So if the endpoint's integrated with a LDAP or AD environment, they'd have their directory dialing here. There's a participants list in the center of the panel that would show any active calls that are connected and give you far-end controls if far-end controls were available. We have the ability to, if they had multiple cameras, we could route multiple cameras there and choose which camera we want to select, and the PTZ controls will be present within there as well. Selecting your content source that's being routed, that would come out in a pop-out. Also, choose to start sharing or stop sharing, and your output selection. So if you had a codec that was going to dual displays or 3 displays, whatever multiple display configuration you might have, you could have different outputs. So maybe one output for your video, one output for your content, and then you could choose to route that wherever you'd like. Some of the big enhancements that we made to the VTC panel is we also now have the ability to relabel virtually everything that's in here. So in previous instances of this, like if you didn't like the text camera input above that button there, you couldn't relabel that. If you same thing, content input, output. So you have the ability to make these things visible or not visible, rename them. And so there's a lot more flexibility in how you can design this. We've also added the ability to add some macros in here. So there's an option here where you can have like a drop list macro bank. So if you had some layout selections that you wanted to execute, and we have an advanced button that you can embed that does a little pop out from the left-hand side of the screen, where if you had additional macro banks or additional controls, maybe the menu controls for the codec, something of that nature, those can be embedded here with, again, pretty minimal configuration. So that is panels. New component concepts. In addition to the new components themselves, we actually have a lot of new concepts here that we've introduced into the individual components. And even if you just actually take a look here there's 2 images at the bottom of this slide. You'll notice if you look on the left-hand image, those button sizes are set to the default size. And then over on the right-hand side, you can see the buttons are a little bit larger and there's more margin or spacing between those buttons. One of the challenges that we had in our previous releases is the size of the buttons, the margin between the buttons, and all of those kind of various items were all controlled by the theme. And to some degree, those properties are still associated with the theme. So, in Utelogy, we have 3 default themes currently. We've got our Cobalt theme, our Utelium theme, and our Obsidian theme. The Cobalt theme is the one that you see in these images here, kind of that blue background. It kind of mimics like almost the Zoom look and feel. We've got our default Utelium theme, and then we've got an Obsidian theme that kind of has a black background and white buttons. Kind of looks maybe a little like certain Microsoft interfaces you've seen in the past, things of that nature. Now, again, certain elements are still driven or dictated by the theme. However, in previous releases, if you said, hey, I don't like the size of the buttons, I want my buttons to be larger or smaller, I want there to be more or less margin between those buttons, you would have effectively had to have created a new theme altogether. Or at an absolute minimum, you would have had to taken one of the existing themes and kind of heavily modified it. So now with these new concepts that we've introduced, item scale, item margin, wrap, and stretch factor, some of these more basic everyday changes that you might want to make to tailor the user interface to your customer's needs can much more easily and quickly be made. And I'd like to go ahead now and demonstrate some of these concepts for you live. So let's go ahead, do item scale, start with that. So if I go ahead, if I go to my routing page that I have configured here, actually, you know what? I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to bring up a different model file for this one. Let's go ahead and bring up our huddle room example that we've got here. Kind of similar to the image that you got pictured in the PowerPoint slide. So if I do this online, and if I go back to my model file for the huddle room example, when I go to my home page, and I go to the source selector component, which is presenting those three options on the page, when I scroll down in this component, you'll see there's a number of new features. And one of the biggest features that we're talking about here is this item scale. So by default, when a component gets added, it's going to be at 100%. That's basically its default size. So if you were to add a new source selector, this item scale property would be set to 100. You can see that I went ahead and saved that, and you can see that the size of those buttons has decreased. So if I want to double the size of those buttons, obviously I could just come in here. I could set a value of like 200, for instance, to these. I'll save that change, and you can actually see that in the preview window. You already saw it update, but I'll go back to my browser session here, and sure enough, there we go. Those buttons have increased greatly in size. I'm going to go ahead and set a value to these of 150, just to make them a little bit smaller. But maybe your customer says, oh, the buttons are too close together. I want a little more spacing. You know, it's a little too hard for me. I feel like I'm hitting one button and maybe accidentally touching another. Well, we can now just increase the margin between these items. Now, it is important to note that we have a property in our components, both of item margin, the ones that support it, as well as margin. We've always had margin in our components. Margin increases the margin around the entire component as a whole. So when you have a source selector like this, where you have three buttons, there is a margin running around the entire container that those buttons are contained within. So adding margin to the property or the component as a whole is going to put margin around the outside of the entire component, whereas adjusting item margin is going to adjust the margin within the component between the buttons inside. Now you can see that when I scroll over this here, I'm presented with a little pop-up that says enter in an EM value, value margin. You can do top, right, bottom, or left. If I simply want to apply a margin of like 2 EM, for instance, to the entire thing, that's going to put 2 EM of margin on the left, right, top, and bottom. And go ahead and save that. Back, you can already see that in the preview window, but here you can see that the margin between those buttons increased. I could obviously do the same thing on the inverse side of that, so I could just specify like 0 M, for instance. I can save that. And now if I go back to my model file, you can see that there's absolutely zero spacing between those components. So great amount of flexibility. There will be no value specified by default. There's going to be a default margin associated with each component, but you can modify as need be now. So item scale and item margin, two very important concepts. One of the other new concepts here is the idea of wrap. So this may seem a little basic at the onset, but in previous builds, if you had a scenario where you had lots of sources, so on this particular page, I've only got 3 sources, but maybe I had a scenario where I had 5, 6, 7, 10 sources on this page. Previously, those buttons wouldn't wrap. They wouldn't go to the next line. They would just continue to kind of run off the side of the page, and then you'd have a page that you would scroll, and that didn't provide the best user experience. So now, and one way that you could have gotten around that in the past is you could have maybe added 2 components, but then you had to group things together, and there was ways to achieve the outcome, but it wasn't the most effective. It wasn't the most desirable. So now we've added in this concept of wrap. And by defining a value in the wrap field, you can, if I hover over this, it says the number of items to show per row. So if I simply set my maximum number of items to show per row to 2, and I do a file save on that, and again, you can already see in the preview window there, but if I go back to this, you can see that now it's wrapped that third item to the next line. So doesn't matter what the number of items per line you want is, whether it's 5 or 6 or 7, doesn't matter. It'll just wrap anything beyond that down to the next line, all contained within the same component, so you don't have to worry about concepts like grouping things together, creating different routing statements, and trying to kind of manipulate Utelogy to get the user interface to do what you want to do. Now it just lays out however you'd like to see that managed. Go ahead and get rid of my wrap value there. And for the final concept of stretch factor, I'm actually going to pull up another model file here. So I'm going to navigate over to our command center model file. And in this particular example here, we've done a number of projects where we've had large command and control center environments, large video wall environments, integrating with like a Barco CMS, a view wall processor, Christie Phoenix, you name it. And in these particular instances, we've developed a pretty efficient user interface for managing and manipulating those types of environments. Now, this was all built out of different components. Got a layout list setter component here. We've got our video wall layout component and our stream list component. But as you can see in this particular instance, the layout list setter, the video wall layout component, and the stream list are kind of all evenly spaced on the page. If, however, I had a customer who had a really large video wall and they wanted to give more weight to the center video wall component, beyond just simply going in and setting my justification and my alignment and my positioning of those flow containers, what I can also do now is I can add a stretch factor onto this. So if I go ahead and I take a look at this model, I'm going to navigate over command center example file. I'm going to go to the view page, which is the page that we're on. You can see that this is all tabbed out. So I've got those 3 tabs on the top. I've got my left wall, my center wall, and my right wall. And then within each one of those tabs, I've got different flow containers. So I've got a tab for all my layout list setter components, my heading. I've got a tab for my video wall layout. I've got a tab for my stream list. Again, if I wanted to more heavily weight the center items, which is that video wall layout, what I can do is I can go into my flow container for that component where that component is contained. You can see right now there's a stretch factor value of 0 defined. But if I were to put a stretch factor value of 1 and save this, and now if I go back to this model file and refresh it, you can see that the layout and the sources now are being forced out to the outer edges of the page. Now in this instance, I haven't increased the size of my video wall. I certainly could. That's a property that's available, is to go in and define a max width and a max height for the video wall component. But by putting on a stretch factor, I've really forced those images or those other components and items out to the side. One area that you would probably use stretch factor the most is maybe down in the footer. You can actually see that we've done the same thing in the footer here. So down at the bottom where we've got our view, we've got our volume controls and the different audio selection and things of that nature. Because we don't have enough items to fill the footer entirely, if I didn't have a stretch factor, you might see that the view button is sitting in a little further right from the left edge there, or maybe these items on the bottom of the page are sitting in a little bit further to the left. So by applying a stretch factor in the footer, actually I can go ahead and take a look at that here. Sure we already have that defined, and you can see, yes, in fact, so I've got a stretch factor value of 1. So if I go ahead and remove my stretch factor, and if I refresh my interface yet again here, and you can see now those items are sent by putting a stretch factor on in my center flow container. I'm forcing the other items out to the edges of the page to provide a little bit cleaner look and experience here. Stretch factor is probably, of the concepts that we've discussed, one that probably needs the most manipulation. I'd really encourage you to maybe take some of these example model files. You can kind of play around with it a little bit, see how it suits your liking, and you can certainly use the component reference guide to gain a deeper, better understanding of that as well. Go ahead and save some of these changes back. And now if I go refresh my page, and everything's back to normal there. Wonderful. So, another new concept that we've introduced in the 203 release is extended resources. Extended resources can actually be used for a number of things. We're going to be discussing the two most commonly used concepts for extended resources here today. The two most common scenarios would be either importing your own images. So if, for instance, the customer had their own logo that they wanted to use, you can actually see in the two examples at the bottom of this page here, over on the left-hand example, we've just got our Utelogy image, but then on the right-hand side of the page, you can see we've got that Simco image there. So if a customer had their own logo, or maybe even a button, so if you didn't like the image that we're using for the HDMI cable, you wanted to import your own, you could certainly do that. Now, importing images is actually something that you have had the ability to do in previous releases. The challenge is that in order to utilize those, what you would have had to have done is in the directory path where Utelogy gets installed, so in C, Program Files, Utelogy, there's a resources folder in here. The resources folder is where all of the default items go. So our components, our images, the themes, all of that good stuff. And within resources, we have this folder called images, and this is the image repository that basically it would pull from anytime you go to select a button image or a logo or anything of that nature. Now, in previous releases, you could have put any one of those logos in here. You could have simply dropped it in this folder. The challenge is that if you were to do an update or if something changed in your environment, there was a potential for that resources folder to be overwritten. And if you had embedded your company's logo or your customer's logo in here, and they do an upgrade and now the logo is lost, well then, they go to pull up the user interface and there's nothing present in that area of the UI anymore. So what we've done is, again, we've introduced this concept of extended resources. And you can actually see what I've done here is I've created, and by default, when the application gets installed, there actually wouldn't be any folders in here. So we don't create any directory paths or folder instances until they're needed. But as I mentioned earlier, in the standard resources path, that folder we were pulling those images for the image library from was simply called images. So what I've done in this instance is I've created a folder called images. I've dropped some stock images in there. We'll go ahead and drop this other one in there as well. And so now, anytime you go to choose something from the image library, if I go back and in this command center example model file, for instance, if I go to my interface page, you can see the logo that's currently selected is this. I can go ahead and click on that. It's going to reference my image library. And actually, you can see already that it's referencing those images in my extended resources. So we're going to actually check the extended resources folder first to see what's available in that directory path. If there's anything there, great, we'll grab it. And we're going to include that as well as the originals in the standard resource path there. So in this particular instance, I'll go ahead and select this BP logo. Go ahead and do a file save. And now if I go back and refresh, you can see that the BP logo that I chose that was in my extended resources path is now available. I'm going to go ahead for this, though. Next item, I'm going to go back to that huddle room example that we had previously. And one of the other new concepts that we discussed was background image. So background image is actually an entirely new concept. And what I can do for this here is I can go into my uServer environment. I can select a background image. Again, this will pull from the same extended resources folder directory path. I personally am a golfer. I don't know if we have any golfers on today's meeting. I'm going to go ahead and select this high resolution background image that I downloaded. Click OK. And I'm going to pull up this. I'm going to refresh my interface. And there we go. One thing to note with both any logo images you're using, or maybe any background images that you're using, I would just typically recommend that the image you're using is either equal to or exceeds the resolution that it's going to be used within on the page. So if you know that that logo that you have, if you know that you're going to be, your user interface device is has a resolution of 1920 by 1080, and you know that that logo is going to occupy maybe 100 by 100 pixels, I would just make sure that the logo or image you're using is, again, either equal to or greater than the resolution is going to occupy on the screen. We will scale. I did some tests with this, and if you were to download, like a low resolution image, maybe for like the background image here, we will upscale that or upconvert it just to fill the screen, but it may not provide the best visual experience that you're looking for. So just be careful in the images and items that you're using, and you should be good from there. So I'm going to go ahead, and you can actually see now, if I go into my images, and if I were to simply move this image that I'm using as my background out of that path, I go back, navigate to here, go back and refresh my interface. If I actually just disconnect, if I reconnect to my interface, when I go back, that image is no longer available because I removed it from the path. So I'm just going to go ahead and clear that out. We'll use the standard background that's associated with the theme. And now we'll be back to Cobalt. Excellent. So one of the other items that we're going to be discussing here, and it actually appears that maybe I had skipped over this earlier in the component section, and yes, I did in fact, was the button. So in our widgets category, we have a new component called a button. Again, this has been available in previous releases, but didn't necessarily always work the way that we had intended it to. So we've massaged this component a little bit and updated it to work a lot better than it had previously. The button functionality is pretty basic in concept. For this one, I'm going to reference that UI reference model file that I have created, and I actually have on my widgets page, I have a button. So if I reference that model file and I go to this page, see I've got a button here. You can obviously restyle and resize this button. So I've currently got it set to an action button type. So any of our different styles can be applied, whether I want it to be a menu button style, a command button style, navigation, feature button, etc. All of those same concepts would apply here. Just like I showed you earlier in the routing components where I was resizing and manipulating that, so I can also change the scale of the button. So I could set this to a value of 200, for instance, and you can see in the preview window that it's changing the size of that button. I'm just going to go ahead and set this back to defaults. But this button allows you to do is you can see that there is a behavior for directive in here. So if I choose my directive, you can see that I have a target and a command. And similar to creating a macro in the Utelogy environment, I can pick really anything that's available in the system. So if I want to execute a system command, like starting up the system, shutting down the system, I can certainly do that. If I have a macro bank that I want to reference, I had that layout macro bank that I showed you earlier. I could have it execute any one of those macros within the bank. I have interface options. So if I wanted to have like a pop-out window, for instance, I wanted to embed a button down in the footer that would create a pop-out, and then I could embed controls on that pop-out window or that page. I could do that here. So I can do an interface pop page, select my width and my animations and the page that I want to go to. But really, again, anything that can be done in a macro or a routing statement or a system command or an interface command can be done here through this new widget button component. There's a lot of flexibility to it, and you can do virtually anything that you'd like here with it. So one last component that, again, I think has existed in our product library for some time is the heading component. The earlier version of this component just had a single heading field. And actually, you can see what we've done here now is we found that most of the instances where our customers were using a heading component, they were actually normally using two. They typically had like a master heading, and then they would have a subheading field. That's pretty typical, pretty common. So we just made that kind of standard set of the default component. So just like we have that item scale, item size, within some of the other components we've already discussed, we have that for the font size here. So default value would be 100. You can choose to go up or down from there. You can select whether you want the text to be bold or normal. You can even specify a color. By default, this is going to be blank, and it's just going to be white. And then obviously the label is the text that's going to be embedded within the heading itself. Same thing down here. So I've got a subheading. Normal, 200, green. And you can say I actually labeled it that way. If I go back to my user interface, and if I go to this page, you can see, so there's my bold and 400 heading text, and then my normal and 200, which is my subheading text. So with that, that is going to conclude today's 203 updates and presentation.